All right, welcome to the Explainer. You know that feeling, right? Being trapped by endless, complicated rules that seem to completely miss the point? Well, today we're going to dig into a really different way of thinking about this, something called principles-based regulation. We're drawing on some fascinating insights from a paper by Julia Black at the London School of Economics.
I mean, we've all felt it, that sense of being tangled up in red tape, just bogged down by rules for everything. But what if the answer isn't just to get rid of rules? What if the real solution is to have a completely different kind of rule?
And here's the core problem. The more detailed and specific you make a rule, the more you're basically inviting people to find a clever way around it. The paper calls this creative compliance. It becomes this game of just ticking the boxes, following the letter of the law, but totally ignoring the spirit of it. And that is the exact problem this whole new approach tries to fix.
So what's the alternative to that mountain of detailed instructions? Well, it's about flipping the script entirely. It's a huge shift from focusing on specific actions to focusing on the overall goal. Okay, this slide breaks it down perfectly. On the one hand, you have that bright line rule. Super specific, right? But also maybe a little too easy to game. Then in the middle, you get the principle. Treat customers fairly. That's the goal. But what does fairly actually mean in practice? And the minute you try to define that, you end up with the monster on the right, the super complex rule that, ironically, just creates a whole new set of loopholes to exploit. Let me give you a great way to think about this. Detailed rules, they're like a 100-page recipe. You have to follow every single measurement, every single step, exactly as it's written. But a principle is more like a chef's core philosophy. It's the guiding idea that allows them to be creative, to use their judgment, and to achieve the real goal, making a fantastic dish.
So you can see why this idea is so appealing, right? The source material we're looking at even calls the promise of principles-based regulation, or PBR, a kind of utopian vision, and it's not hard to see why. This quote just nails the heart of that promise. It's about getting away from that top-down, we-tell-you-what-to-do system. The dream is a smarter, more grown-up relationship, where regulators and businesses are actually on the same team, trusting each other to get to the right outcome without being buried in mountains of paperwork. But as you probably guessed, it's not quite that simple. This is where things start to get really tricky, because just writing down a nice-sounding principle, well, that doesn't mean your work is done. How it actually plays out in the real world is what truly matters. So the paper points out this really crucial difference. First, you have formal PBR. That's just having the principles written down in the rulebook. It's the on-paper version. But then you have substantive PBR, and this is all about the culture. It's when everyone, regulators and firms, actually behaves differently, focusing on dialogue and real-world results. One is just theory, the other is practice. And this brings us to the most fascinating part of this whole story. This is where the elegant, simple solution starts to show its own hidden complexities. We're talking about its paradoxes, the ways it can actually end up working against itself.
And get this, the paper identifies a whopping 7 of these paradoxes, 7 different ways this approach can backfire. We're going to dive into a couple of the most powerful and honestly counterintuitive ones.
Okay, first up is a real head-scratcher that gets to the very purpose of a rule in the first place. Let's talk about the paradox of interpretation. Here's the thing. The same exact principle can be both crystal clear and totally confusing at the same time. It just depends on who's looking at it. For a manager trying to hit a target, a principle like treat customers fairly is great. It clarifies the ultimate goal. But for the company's lawyer, it's a nightmare. It's legally vague and gives them zero certainty to protect the company from a lawsuit.
So let's look at the next one. How do companies actually behave when you give them more freedom? You'd think it would unleash all this amazing innovation, right? Well, maybe not.
This one is huge. The whole idea is to give firms the flexibility to find better ways of doing things. But that freedom can actually create fear. A company starts thinking, what if we try something new, and 5 years from now, a regulator decides they don't like it and hits us with a giant fine? So, instead of being brave and innovating, they do the exact opposite. They play it super safe and stick to the most boring, conservative interpretation possible. All of these little contradictions about how we interpret rules, how we comply with them, how we enforce them, they all build up to one final massive insight that is at the absolute heart of this whole debate. And this quote just lays it all out. This entire system is designed to create a relationship based on trust. But, and this is the killer detail, for the system to even have a chance of working, a whole lot of trust has to already be there. It's the ultimate chicken and egg problem. You need trust to make it work, but you're using it to build trust.
So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a really fundamental question. When we push for these simpler, principle-based rules, are we actually building a solid foundation for a better, more trusting system, or are we just taking a huge leap of faith, crossing our fingers and hoping that everyone decides to act in the spirit of the law, even when the letter isn't there to force them?